There is a self that does not negotiate. Not stubborn, not unreasonable, simply finished with the negotiating table entirely once certain conditions arrive. That self stays contained until the stakes stop pretending to be small. Most situations do not require it. Most days call for the version that discusses, compromises, finds the middle position that keeps everything functioning smoothly. That version handles almost everything. Almost. There is a threshold, though, a specific point where the stakes stop being manageable through discussion, where compromise would cost something too significant to trade away for the sake of staying comfortable. At that threshold, the non-negotiating self gets released. Not randomly, not without reason, specifically because the smaller version, built for smaller situations, cannot meet what the larger situation actually demands. This is not a loss of control. It is the correct application of exactly the right tool for exactly the right moment. A hammer stays in the drawer for situations that need a screwdriver. It comes out when the situation actually calls for force rather than precision applied gently. The non-negotiating self is that hammer, kept contained deliberately because most situations do not need it, released deliberately when the situation makes clear that anything less would fail completely. That release is not chaos, it is calibration, matching the actual size of the response to the actual size of what is being faced. Apology used to follow intensity automatically, as though intensity itself required defending, as though showing the full weight of an internal state was somehow excessive, needing to be immediately softened with explanation. That apology stopped. Some battles require everything available without apology for bringing it. Not every battle. Most situations call for measured response, calibrated to their actual size. But some do not. Some require full commitment, full presence, the complete weight of whatever capability exists, applied without holding anything back for the sake of appearing moderate. Apologizing for that full commitment misunderstands what the battle actually required. It treats necessary intensity as an overreaction when it was actually the correctly sized response to a genuinely large situation. That misunderstanding does not continue. When a battle requires everything, everything gets brought, without a follow-up explanation softening the delivery, without immediately retreating into a smaller posture to reassure anyone made uncomfortable by the size of the actual response. Discomfort in observers does not indicate the intensity was wrong. It often just indicates the observer was expecting something smaller than what the situation genuinely demanded. That expectation is not the responsibility being managed here. The battle is, and the battle gets everything it requires, delivered without an apology attached for having required it.
There was a request, implicit and often explicit, for the calm version to remain the only version ever shown. Steady, manageable, predictable enough to never require adjustment from anyone comfortable with the calm presentation. That request assumed something specific, that underestimating what existed beneath the calm would carry no consequence. The calm presentation disappeared the moment that underestimation became the actual strategy being used. Underestimation is a specific kind of mistake, It assumes the visible surface represents the entire depth, that what gets shown in easy, low-stakes conditions is the complete capability, rather than simply the calibrated response to low-stakes conditions. That assumption gets tested eventually. Someone believing the calm was the whole story pushes past what calm conditions were ever designed to absorb, and the calm, at that point, has already done its job. It was accurate for what it was responding to. It is not obligated to remain accurate once the conditions change into something calm was never built to handle. So it left. Not out of anger specifically, out of the simple fact that continuing to present calm in conditions that no longer called for it would have been dishonest to what the actual moment required. What replaced it was not performance. It was the accurate response to having been underestimated by someone who mistook a calibrated surface for the entire available range.
Rage is loud, chaotic, often working against its own goals through sheer lack of direction. That is not what this is. Beast mode is precision, not chaos. It is everything that was previously held back, now applied without the holding. The leash exists for a reason. It restrains capability that unrestrained could cause damage disproportionate to what most situations actually require. Removing the leash does not mean removing the aim. It means removing the restraint on force while keeping the precision that was always present underneath the restraint. That distinction matters enormously. Rage swings wildly, hoping something connects. Precision with the leash removed swings exactly where it was always going to swing, just without the artificial limitation that previously reduced the force behind the swing. This is not losing control. It is the opposite. It is control, fully applied, without the additional layer of restraint that was appropriate for smaller situations, but insufficient for this one. The aim does not change when the leash comes off. Only the force behind what was already precisely aimed. That is the actual mechanism here, not chaos unleashed. Precision, finally allowed to operate at its actual capacity, rather than the reduced capacity restraint had been enforcing. A switch implies something binary, off then suddenly on, requiring some external trigger to flip the state from one to the other. That is not accurate to what actually happens here. There is no switch. There is only a door that stops getting held closed. What exists behind that door was always there, not created in the moment of release. Present, continuously, held back deliberately through ongoing effort applied specifically to keeping it contained. That containment requires energy, constant, if not always conscious, effort spent holding the door shut against what would otherwise come through it. Releasing it does not require flipping anything on. It requires releasing the effort that was holding it closed, simply stopping the specific, ongoing work of containment. That reframe matters because it changes where the actual effort has always been located, not in producing the intensity when needed, in suppressing it during every moment it was not needed. So when the door stops getting held closed, nothing new gets created. What was already present simply stops being restrained. That is a different kind of event than a switch flipping. It is not activation, it is release, the absence of the effort that had been required continuously to keep something present but contained.
Politeness left the room. Not dramatically necessarily, simply stepped out, having done what it could do, recognizing its limits had already been reached by whatever the room currently required. What remained did not ask twice. It did not need to. Politeness operates through asking, through repeated requests, softened language, patience extended toward whoever is not yet meeting what the situation requires. That patience has limits, reasonable ones, and once those limits are reached, continuing to operate through polite requesting becomes its own kind of dishonesty. Pretending gentleness still applies to a situation that has already demonstrated it requires something firmer. What remains once politeness steps out does not repeat itself, does not soften the second delivery in hopes it lands better than the first. States what needs to happen clearly once, with the expectation that clarity, delivered without excessive softening, will actually register. That directness is not cruelty. It is efficiency, appropriate for a situation that has already shown polite requesting was not sufficient. Asking twice assumes the first ask simply needed better delivery. Not asking twice assumes the first delivery was already clear, and further softening would only obscure what needed to be understood. So the room gets what it requires, once, clearly, without the repeated gentleness that had already proven insufficient before politeness stepped aside.
Calm was never the natural state. It was constructed deliberately, maintained through consistent effort, presented as though it were simply how things naturally were. That presentation was inaccurate. Calm was the cage worn in public. It was not the natural condition underneath it. Cages are built for containment, for managing something that, left unmanaged, would not fit comfortably within whatever social space it needed to occupy. Calm functioned that way, not dishonestly exactly, strategically, a managed presentation built to allow smooth interaction in situations that could not have absorbed the full, unmanaged intensity actually present underneath it. Recognizing that calm was a cage rather than the natural resting state changes the entire relationship with it. It stops being who this actually is. It becomes a tool, useful in specific conditions, but not accurate as a complete description of what exists when the tool gets set down. That distinction matters because it removes the confusion between the managed presentation and the actual capacity underneath. Calm still gets used in situations that call for it, but it no longer gets mistaken for the whole truth. It was always the cage, useful, deliberate, never the complete picture of what was actually being contained inside it. Rising to an occasion implies building something new specifically for that moment that did not previously exist. That framing does not match what actually happens. The occasion meets what was already waiting. Nothing new gets built in the moment. Preparation happened long before the occasion arrived, not consciously staged for this specific moment, but accumulated continuously through every prior stretch that contributed capability without knowing exactly which future occasion would eventually call for it. So when the moment arrives, nothing gets constructed on the spot. What already existed simply gets applied, already sharpened, already capable, already present, waiting specifically for a demand large enough to justify its use. That distinction matters because it changes what the actual moment represents. Not a test of whether something new can be built quickly enough under pressure. A test of whether what was already built, patiently, over time,
gets recognized and deployed correctly once the appropriate occasion finally shows up. Most of the work happened before this moment. The moment itself is simply where accumulated readiness finally gets used for something worth using it on. So the occasion does not get risen to, it gets met by something that was already standing, fully prepared, long before the occasion had any idea it was about to arrive.
Restraint was extended toward people who never extended anything similar in return. Their cruelty operated without limits. The response to it operated entirely within limits, carefully maintained, regardless of what was being absorbed from the other direction. That imbalance stopped. Restraint toward cruelty that never restrained itself was never actually fairness. It was just one-sided cost. Fairness implies a matched exchange, both sides operating under similar constraints, similar effort, similar willingness to hold something back for the sake of the relationship or the situation continuing smoothly. That matching never existed here. One side restrained consistently, the other side did not restrain at all, taking full advantage of the space that consistent restraint on the other end kept providing. Recognizing that imbalance changed the entire calculation. Continuing to restrain, specifically for the benefit of people demonstrating no interest in reciprocating that restraint, was not virtue. It was simply absorbing a cost that had no matching benefit anywhere in the exchange. So the restraint stopped, specifically toward that pattern, not toward everyone, toward the specific dynamic where limits were being observed on one side only, indefinitely, without any corresponding limit ever being observed from the other direction. That correction was overdue. It is in place now. The absorbing of one-sided cost dressed up as patience does not continue. There is a force that gets deliberately fed, not accidentally encountered, not something that simply shows up uninvited, cultivated, on purpose, because of what it has consistently provided. That force has never once failed when everything else did. Other resources are unreliable. Motivation fluctuates. Confidence wavers depending on circumstance. Support from outside depends on people who have their own limits, their own priorities, their own reasons to be unavailable exactly when needed most. This force does not depend on any of that. It operates independently, internally, sourced from something that does not require favorable external conditions to remain functional. That reliability is why it gets fed deliberately. Not because intensity is inherently valuable on its own, because this specific force has demonstrated repeatedly across every condition that has tested it that it does not disappear exactly when it becomes most needed. Everything else has at some point. This has not. So the feeding continues, purposefully, understanding exactly what is being maintained and exactly why it matters. Not indulgence, investment in the one internal resource that has proven itself completely dependable regardless of what external conditions happen to be present at any given moment. Honesty, delivered without the cushioning most social interaction requires, sounds harsh. It is not dishonest for sounding that way. Beast mode is simply honesty without the manners that usually soften it. Manners exist for good reasons. They smooth interaction, reduce unnecessary friction, allow difficult truths to be delivered in ways that do not needlessly damage relationships that would otherwise survive the truth being spoken plainly. That softening has its place. Most situations benefit from it. Some do not.
Some situations have already exhausted the value that softening provides, reaching a point where continued cushioning would obscure the actual truth rather than simply making it easier to hear. At that point, the manners get set aside, not because honesty changed, because the delivery method that honesty usually travels through stopped being useful, and the honesty itself became more important than preserving the comfort of the softened delivery. What comes through at that point is not a different message. It is the same message that was always true, finally delivered without the layers that had been reducing its impact for the sake of making it more comfortable to receive. That discomfort belongs to the truth being finally heard clearly, not to any distortion of what was actually being communicated. Intensity does not get chased, searched for, or manufactured through effort applied specifically toward producing it. It is already present. The only thing that changes is whether the pretending continues or stops. Chasing implies absence, something not currently possessed, requiring pursuit to eventually acquire. That framing has never applied here. What gets called intensity in these moments is not new. It has been present the entire time, consistently, requiring active suppression to remain hidden rather than active pursuit to be found. So nothing gets chased. The pretending simply stops. The performance of having less than what actually exists gets set down, and what was always there becomes visible without requiring any additional effort to produce it. That distinction matters because it clarifies where the actual work has always been happening, not in generating intensity when circumstances call for it, in suppressing it during every circumstance that did not call for it. Removing that suppression is not creation. It is simply the cessation of an ongoing effort that had been directed toward concealment rather than toward production. What was always there remains exactly what it always was. Only the pretending changes, and once it stops, nothing further needs to be chased.
Every earlier instance of holding back exists somewhere in the record. Every moment where the full response was available, but a smaller one got delivered instead, for the sake of managing how it would be received. Those instances did not disappear. They got buried, specifically, beneath the instance that finally did not hold back. Burial implies both presence and absence simultaneously. Still there in the sense that they happen and cannot be erased from having occurred. No longer operative in the sense that they no longer determine what happens going forward. That is the actual relationship with every previous moment of restraint. They contributed to the pattern that eventually broke, each one adding weight to a threshold that was steadily being approached, even while each individual instance appeared on its own to simply be more of the same restrained pattern continuing indefinitely. The pattern did not continue indefinitely. It broke at a specific point determined by the accumulated weight of every earlier instance that had been holding back. That breaking did not erase the earlier instances. It buried them, specifically, beneath the moment that finally represented something different. What stands now is built on that burial, not despite the earlier restraint, because of it. Every instance that held back contributed directly to the threshold that eventually got crossed.
Something refused to stay asleep. Not randomly. Not without cause.
specifically because of sustained pushing that continued past the point where staying asleep remained a reasonable option. That was never a choice made independently. It was a response to pressure that did not stop applying itself. Responsibility for what wakes up under sustained pressure belongs at least partially to whatever kept applying that pressure, past the point where a reasonable person would have expected something to eventually respond. This is not an excuse offered casually. It is an accurate accounting of cause and effect. Sleep in this context was a choice, maintained deliberately for as long as maintaining it remained reasonable given the conditions being faced. Conditions changed. The pushing continued past reasonable into territory that made continued sleep no longer a sustainable response to what was actually happening. At that point, something woke. Not through independent decision disconnected from what had been happening externally. Through direct response to pressure that refused to stop, applied by whoever was doing the pushing. That accountability sits where it belongs. Not entirely on what woke up. Substantially on whatever kept pushing, past every reasonable point, until waking became the only remaining response available.
Rejection arrives repeatedly and gets treated as fuel rather than as defeat. Deliberately. The fire gets fed with every rejection because rejection has proven to be the most reliable fuel available. Other fuels are inconsistent. Encouragement is not always available. Support fluctuates based on circumstances outside anyone's control. Success itself, ironically, sometimes produces complacency rather than continued drive. Rejection is different. It shows up reliably, whether wanted or not, providing a consistent supply of something that, properly used, generates more forward motion than almost anything else available. That use is not automatic. It requires a deliberate decision to treat rejection as material rather than as verdict, as something to be converted into continued effort rather than something to be absorbed as confirmation that the effort should stop. That conversion happens here consistently because it has proven across enough repetition to produce exactly the outcome needed: undeniability. What gets built from rejection, converted deliberately into fuel, becomes difficult to dismiss precisely because it was forged directly from the material that was supposed to prevent it from existing at all. So the rejection keeps coming, and it keeps getting fed to something that has learned, specifically, how to use it.
A mask serves its purpose until it does not. Until the pressure applied against it exceeds what the material was ever designed to withstand. Calm is the mask. What wins is whatever exists underneath it once the mask finally gives. Masks are useful. They allow presentation that differs from what exists underneath for reasons that often make sense given the situation being navigated. That usefulness has limits. Enough sustained pressure, applied consistently enough, eventually exceeds what any mask can continue to absorb without cracking. When that crack happens, what becomes visible is not something newly created. It is what was always there, previously obscured by the presentation the mask was providing. That is the actual mechanism behind whatever eventually wins in these situations. Not the mask itself, however carefully maintained. What exists underneath, finally exposed once the mask could no longer continue absorbing whatever pressure eventually cracked it.
Recognizing that changes the relationship with the mask entirely. It was never the actual source of strength. It was simply the presentation, useful for a while, until conditions demanded something the presentation itself could not provide. What wins was always underneath, waiting patiently for the mask to finally give way to what it had been covering the entire time.
Losing control implies something happening without direction, without intention, spiraling beyond what was ever actually chosen. That is not what this is. Control gets released deliberately and completely on specific terms that were already decided before the release happened. The distinction between losing control and releasing it deliberately is enormous, even though both might look similar from outside observation. Losing control means direction disappears. Nobody, including whoever is experiencing it, knows exactly where it goes or when it stops. Releasing control deliberately means the direction was already determined. The terms were already set. What happens once the release occurs follows a path that was already understood, even if the intensity of following that path looks from outside like something uncontrolled. That is the actual mechanism here, not chaos mistaken for release. Release mistaken for chaos by anyone unfamiliar with how deliberately this was actually being managed. Complete does not mean uncontrolled. It means fully applied without holding back any portion that could have been withheld, but still operating within terms that were already decided before the moment of release ever arrived. That is control, exercised through the decision to release fully, rather than control abandoned through some failure to maintain it.
Fear gets attached to the wrong label constantly, called anger, assumed to be rage, uncontrolled, unpredictable, something to be managed carefully because of how volatile it appears. That label is inaccurate. What actually gets feared is not anger. It is what arrives once patience has fully run out. Anger is loud, immediate, often short-lived, burning through its own energy quickly enough that it does not require much strategic concern. Patience running out is different entirely. It represents something that has been building, deliberately restrained, across an extended period, only arriving once every reasonable alternative has already been exhausted. That arrival is not sudden in the way anger often is. It is the end point of a long process, meaning it carries the accumulated weight of everything that patience was absorbing during the entire stretch it remained intact. Fearing that correctly requires understanding it is not a temporary flare. It is the result of sustained restraint finally concluding, having reached its actual limit, rather than simply being triggered by a single provoking moment. That distinction matters because it explains why this specific thing gets treated with more caution than ordinary anger ever would. It is not volatile, it is final, and final carries a different weight than anything temporary ever could.
Gentleness gets extended toward limits automatically, as a default posture, regardless of whether those limits have ever extended anything similar in return. That default stopped. Gentleness toward limits that were never gentle in return was simply another form of one-sided cost. Limits that respect what they are placed against deserve gentle handling. That respect creates a fair exchange, worth maintaining because both sides are contributing something toward the relationship staying intact. Limits that show no similar respect do not deserve the same treatment. Continuing gentleness in that direction simply absorbs cost without any corresponding benefit ever being returned. Recognizing that imbalance changed the default posture entirely, not toward every limit encountered, specifically toward the ones that had already demonstrated repeatedly that gentleness in return was never going to be part of the arrangement. So the gentleness stopped there, replaced by whatever response those specific limits actually earned through their own consistent behavior. That correction is overdue, applied specifically and deliberately, not broadly or indiscriminately. Limits that were never gentle do not receive gentleness anymore. They receive exactly what their own pattern has been requesting the entire time, whether they intended to request it or not.
People call it losing yourself, as if something breaks, as if control disappears, as if the strongest version of you is somehow the least authentic. It isn't. Beast mode is not losing yourself. It is becoming completely yourself. Most people never operate at full capacity. Only the acceptable version, the polite version, the restrained version, the version built to fit comfortably inside everyone else's expectations. Useful, necessary, but incomplete. Because beneath that controlled surface, there is more discipline, more intensity, more conviction, more resilience, more force than everyday life ever asks you to reveal. Most of it stays locked away, not because it doesn't exist, because it isn't required, until the moment it is. Then something changes. The hesitation disappears. The second-guessing falls silent. The constant management of how you're perceived no longer matters. Every part of you aligns behind one objective. Nothing competing, nothing divided, nothing held back. That is not losing yourself. That is finding every piece of yourself at once. Not subtraction, integration, not chaos, clarity. The energy that was scattered becomes focused. The strength that was restrained becomes available. The discipline you've been building in silence finally has somewhere to go. Everything moves in one direction. No internal argument, no negotiation, no permission seeking, only execution. Everything has been leading here. The version of you that stopped negotiating with excuses, the apology that disappeared, the comfort that was exposed as a cage, the rejection that became fuel instead of failure, the mask that finally cracked, the limits you stopped accepting, the patience you stopped wasting on what refused to change, the fear you refused to obey, the hunger that outlived comfort, the discipline that outlasted motivation. Every lesson, every scar, every sacrifice, every decision, all of it gathers here, not to create someone new, to uncover who was there all along. The strongest version of you was never missing, only restrained. Now, remove the restraint. Bring every part of yourself into the fight. Nothing hidden, nothing divided, everything at once.